A warm welcome to all to this first Future of South Asia Global Hub webinar series on the status of sustainable development goals in South Asia. Thank you for joining. Welcome all speakers, participants, and our colleagues. This is the first webinar out of the 6 webinars in this series, and we hope that this webinar will be the first among many future gatherings where we hope to reconvene the group of experts to discuss science and policy pathways to help achieve the SDGs in the South Asia region. We also hope that this webinar will be an opportunity for all of us, all participants, to learn more about sustainable development in the context of South Asia. And problems faced by all of us in South Asia are similar in nature. So in this context, I consider this gathering as very important. And now I request Dr. Smriti Basnat, Interim Director of South Asia Regional Office, to share our current and future programs at the Future of South Asia Global Hub and also conduct the proceedings. Smriti.
Thank you very much, Professor Satish. I also extend a welcome to all the speakers, all the delegates, and also all our participants. And I hope you all engage with us to the end of the event, which ends at 4 o'clock today. So let me just begin with where we are and what we are doing at the South Asia Global Hub. Of course, we have a vision, which is to work towards sustainability, and a strategic objective, the very objective of today, which is we facilitate research and innovation. We build and mobilize networks through our various stakeholder engagements through webinars. And also we try and shape the global narratives in the form of policy briefs and a call for action. The Future Earth Global Governing Council comprises of all the various organizations that you see in my screen: United Nations University, UN, United Nations Education Scientific Cultural Organization, the Belmont Forum, International Science Council, World Meteorological Organization, and many more partners. This is where we are represented. So also glad to share with the gathering here that the South Asia Global Hub is the 8th existing global hub in the Future Earth network. We just got the promotion. It's not a promotion, but we got this announced in the month of June 2021. And along with us, we have 8 other global hubs in all over the world, with the Global Hub Secretariat in Canada, which functions in the north, US, Colorado in US, and then we have in Taipei in Asia, China, and South Asia in Asia, in the Indian Institute of Science, housed at the Diveja Center for Climate Change. We also have a Global Secretariat Hub in Japan, one in Sweden and France. The Future Earth South Asia region, we have a domain that comprises of the SAARC countries, Myanmar, 2 Indian Ocean Island countries of Mauritius and Maldives. And we want to be an interface between science and policy. That's why the engagement with all of you, the delegates here, are very important for our upcoming webinars and the workshop that we envision for 2023. I would also like to bring attention to all our audiences here that you could be a part of any of these global research networks. So Future Earth is a big umbrella where we have more than 29 global research programs that we liaison with, we work with, and we also help in science communication. We do have a governing council of Future Earth, which was formed in September of 2019, where we have delegates from all the South Asia domain region of Future Earth South Asia. And it was during this meeting that the governing councils prioritized 4 areas that South Asia could work towards, which is food security in terms of nutrition and health. And then we have health sensitization. We have water security. Now we're planning to look into the coastal issues and the risk to coast because of climate issues, sea level rise. And we also have air quality and clean energy as one of our programs. Along with that, we plan to have on-ground pilot programs that we want to work in parallel to our knowledge to action program that we are initiating, where we're looking into sustainable cities and communities, as more than 50%, 60% of space is yet to be developed in South Asia. I would like to also bring your notice to this very virtual meeting that we are here today. So we plan to have 3 sets of program in total, starting with today, starting with the first webinar series on SDGs. And then we plan to bring this to our gathering at SRI, the Sustainable Research Innovation Forum in June, where we plan to have a workshop to chart and curate how we plan to have chapters together for a call for action, which will be a declaration brought out at the end of 2022 December. And we would love to engage with all the speakers and the participants. We'll share you a link where everybody can be stakeholders here. So today, it's a little blurred, sorry, but today we're going to talk about the status of Sustainable Development Goals in South Asia. It's the first webinar series. The second webinar series, we're planning it in March. It will be on tackling hunger and malnutrition in South Asia. The third one is connecting air, climate, and health. The fourth will be on sustainable communities, where we'll have all the various delegates and speakers of this very gathering, of this webinar also included in our upcoming workshops. And then we have one on fortifying health in the Anthropocene. That will be a 5th one. And the 6th webinar, we plan it on protecting our coastlines, identifying development implementations across South Asia. So with that, I'll end our current and future program, just to give you an idea of where we are heading. And the agenda for today is set. All of you must have received our agenda well before time. But just for the participants, I would like to tell you that we planned this webinar in 2 factions, in 2 sections. One, we have a panel discussion for 1 hour, where we have all the delegates talk about various status of SDGs in their own vicinity, in their region, in their country. And then second, we have an overview of SDG status, in particularly in the areas that each of our delegates are working and specializing. So with that, I hand it to Anupama, and I would request her to please introduce our speakers and delegates and moderate the panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Priti. Good morning to all of our speakers, invited speakers. Thank you so much for joining us today. To our attendees, thank you as well for joining. I will quickly share my screen and introduce our panelists, as well as set the context for this discussion. So first, first and foremost, we actually were expecting one more panelist today, Dr. Fahmida Khatun. She is the Executive Director of the Center for Policy Dialogue at Dhaka in Bangladesh, but just today morning, she informed me that she would not be able to join us live for the panel discussion because of an urgent meeting requirement for upcoming mayoral elections in Dhaka, but she will be joining us live for her talk, so please stay tuned for that. We have Mr. Khurshid Alam, who's joined us here from the United Nations Development Program in Bhutan. He's the Deputy Resident Representative there. Thank you, Mr. Khurshid, for joining us. We have Mr. Purna Prasad Chapagai. He is a lecturer at the College of Natural Resources at the Royal University of Bhutan, where he leads the BSc Sustainable Development Program, as well as a master's program in the same field. Thank you, Mr. Purna, for joining us. And then we have Mr. Sundar Narayan Mishra. He is currently an advisor for government consulting with Ernst & Young, and he also heads the SDG unit at the government of Odisha in India, in Bhubaneswar. He recently shifted there after working with the Niti Aayog in Delhi. Thank you, Mr. Sundar, for joining us. And we have Professor Sanjeev Sobhee. He is actually the Pro-Vice Chancellor and a Professor of Applied Economics and Development Studies at the University of Mauritius. He also cannot join us live for the discussion today, but he has shared his responses to the questions for all panelists. So I'll be displaying that to you when we come to his turn. And he will be joining us live for his talk later during the day. And we have Dr. Prajal Pradhan, who is a senior scientist with the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, currently based in Germany, but from Nepal. So he'll be giving us a perspective from Nepal. And then we have Ms. Chamindry Saparamadu, who is the Director General of the Sustainable Development Council of Sri Lanka. She's also here with us live today. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us. Very quickly, before I move on to the first question, I'm sure all of you here have heard of the Sustainable Development Goals. They are also known as the Global Goals, and they're a set of 17 integrated and interrelated goals to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that all of humanity enjoys peace and prosperity by 2030. They build on the Millennium Development Goals that were there in the previous 15 years, from 2000 to 2015. Now, when it comes to the South Asia region, we all know that we're a massive percentage of the global population, and the amount of poverty and hunger and other deprivations that we have here, really global progress on the SDGs would depend a lot on how much we achieve here in the South Asia region. So in the region as a whole, there has been a lot of work being done to identify key policy priorities. And these include creating jobs via balanced economic transformation, provision of essential services and sustainable infrastructure, addressing food insecurity and hunger, promoting gender equality, and implementing low carbon pathways to development. And it's also understood that the success of the SDGs here will depend on addressing capacity gaps and means of implementation, especially with regards to finance, technology, data, monitoring, and accountability. So when it comes to SDGs, there are 2 points that are quite clear. One is that it is impossible to achieve some of these targets without considering some of the other targets, which refers to the linkages between all the SDGs. And secondly, that it isn't possible for individual countries to achieve some SDG targets without cooperating and developing concerted efforts with other countries in the region, as well as in the world at large. So really, countries in the South Asia region can benefit from sub-regional cooperation on SDG implementation, given our shared challenges, cultural and administrative frameworks, and similar initial conditions. So this is really just one particular platform where we brought speakers from these countries here together. And I hope that this clarifies the context behind which we're having this discussion. So the format in which this panel discussion is going to go is, I have 2 questions that are already ready and waiting for our panelists. I'll be asking them one by one in this order. So we'll begin with Mr. Khurshid, go on to Mr. Purna, and then Mr. Sundar. I'll read out Professor Sanjeev's answer, then we'll go to Dr. Prajal, and then finally to Mr. Chamindry. And then we'll do this again for question 2. And then after that, the floor is open for interactive discussion between the panelists in case they have any counter questions to each other. And if not, we have another question for them as well. And then finally, the floor will be open for questions from the audience. So without further ado, let me move to the first question for our panelists, which is, and of course, the panelists can answer this from the perspective of their country or as a region as a whole. So the first question is, do you consider, to Mr. Khurshid right now, do you consider the SDGs to be relevant to South Asia's development needs? And are there any shortcomings of the SDG paradigm that you think need to be addressed to ensure actual sustainable development, keeping planetary boundaries and climate targets in mind? Mr. Khurshid, floor is yours.
Thank you, Anupama, and good morning to everyone, the colleagues and friends listening from all over the world, and also my fellow panelists. Within in a short period of time, opening up such a big discussion would be a difficult challenge for me to answer. So I will be selective and highlight few thoughts and perhaps raise more questions. Whether SDG is relevant and why this question is so important at this moment. I think that we need to unpack a little bit. We are facing an extraordinary scale of development disaster. That's we call COVID crisis. And that is happening within the baseline of climate change impact in many part of the South Asia and also part of the planet. And the nexus between COVID and the climate change impact would have an implication on the pace of SDG implementation. That's for sure. So from that point of view, is a very timely, but unfortunately we don't have much data, and data are emerging to understand how SDGs are being impacted by this, the twin crisis, COVID and climate. But what I can, from the UNDP and UN side, very clearly say that SDGs remain the solution. So we are at the beginning of decade of action that all countries agreed that SDG must be achieved by 2030. The goal is still there, target is still there, despite the shocks that we are experiencing. The SDG will continue to provide the solution. From that point of view, answer to your question, yes, SDGs are relevant. However, we need to be mindful that many of the countries which are experiencing COVID are also facing limited fiscal space and the contraction of GDP. The poverty is on rise, inequality has further deepened. So there are the crisis in the human front and also crisis in the planetary front. So how do we make sure that in our narrative that you mentioned, Anupama, that we have a balanced idea that the welfare of planet or ecosystem resilience and human development resilience are interlinked, and that is why we should not lose focus. So if you say which part of SDG should be more or should receive more focus, I think there is a risk that countries can be selective, that I will focus on A, B, C, D SDG, not E, F, G, H. I think that option is not there. The totality of SDG, which is the health of the planet and welfare of the society and economy, I think we need to look at in an integral manner. 3 areas where I would suggest that we should focus. One is, you very rightly mentioned, is data. Second is in the context of limited resources, COVID-induced challenges economy that are facing, we need to find financing solution, innovative financing solution. And how do we just not mobilize resource, but also find a solution to finance all the SDGs? And finally, on the localization, that remain a core priority. SDG has to be localized across all the levels. Do I have any more time for this round?
No, I think we're all up for now. So we'll come back to you for the second question. And yes, thank you so much. Mr. Purna Prasad, we'll jump off straight to you next, and we'll come back to all these in the interactive discussion later on.
Okay, everybody, good morning once again. I'll straight away get into the question that you have asked. Is SDG relevant to Bhutan? Especially, I mean, my talk will be mostly related to Bhutan. So it's really, really related and relevant to Bhutan. In Bhutan, especially, we have a development plan system of 5 years plan system. Currently, we are in 12th 5-year plan period, starting from 2018 to 2023. And the plan is really aligned towards sustainable development. Just to let you all know that the objective of this 12th 5-year plan is just harmonious and sustainable society through enhanced decentralization. See, so in the objective itself, the word sustainable is there. And I'm sure all of us here know that Bhutan is also following a development philosophy called gross national happiness. And often people tend to think that if GNH, gross national happiness, is away or alienated from sustainable development or not. So probably I'd like to just clarify that these are the same. Perhaps gross national happiness came even way before sustainable development goals were set. So it was in 1972 when our fourth king, His Majesty King Jigme Singye Wangchuk, on his coronation address said that people need to be happy first. So then only development, then only materialistic growth need to be taken into consideration. So first is spiritual and the spiritual health of an individual. So with that, I think sustainable development goals are quite doing well in our context also. If we just look into the report of sustainable development scores, Sustainable Development Report 2021, Bhutan is at 75th out of 165 countries in terms of ranking the country. Almost all the goals, all the 17 goals are in progress. They are not doing, excellently good, but they are not also doing bad. So the progress is moderately increasing. Most of the progresses are moderately increasing. That's how it has been rated in 2021 rating. And yeah, so I think it is quite relevant,
All right, thank you, Mr. Purna. We've gotten your points then. And I'm glad you actually brought up the Gross National Happiness Index in Bhutan. It's quite a unique sort of South Asian version of sustainable development that we find here. Mr. Sundar, can we have your answer to this question next?
Very good morning to everyone, and nice introduction by Khurshid and Purna, and that brings into focus the rather varied and vast canvas of SDGs. Like Khurshid said, it's very difficult to respond in a very short and encapsulated manner, but of course, this is absolutely relevant to everyone. So to that extent, that the question is rather rhetorical, because there is hardly any part of the world or any segment of society anywhere which can actually retract from the significance and the inevitability of pursuing the sustainable development goals. From that point of view, we are actually in front of a set of goals which must be prioritized by everyone and must be actually put on the front burner, I would rather say, from all perspectives. So, there is no other way to look at it. The other thing is, internationally speaking, a lot of anxiety has been expressed by different people that these being voluntary, these being actually self-imposed, then actually doesn't lead to any accountability or any pressure from anywhere to really actually perform. So, well, I can understand the impatience of people to actually see consequences coming in very soon. But, there is a lot of, scope for every one of us to build up a kind of collective urgency and emergency at from local to global level, so that the goals can really be, pressing upon everyone to implement. So from that point of view, this is a kind of, a responsibility everybody has got to make the goals more effective and more functional. So this is only as much as we can do, it will actually perform accordingly. So, there is nothing like external to us. So that is the kind of thing which some people have been concerned about, the rather ineffectiveness of enforceability of the SDGs, but I would look at it from the other point of view. Then coming to the operationalizing part of it, all countries are trying to monitor. A lot of indices have been brought about, like India is having its own national index. We have a global index, and many countries are monitoring in their own ways. I see two, three aspects, two, three concerns to look at, so which can actually make SDGs more effective. If you look at the targets, the goals and targets are very pervasive and very encompassing. every target has many different aspects, and often actually they overlap to other targets. And if you bring in the aspect of interconnectedness that you were talking about in the big data, then that actually makes the whole context very involved and very, very complex. So a lot of indicators chosen by different people in different contexts tend to leave out certain important aspects of targets and goals. So, I mean, when you, in these days of data and metrics, when you focus on certain aspects which are basically highlighted by a set of indicators, then willy-nilly actually what you do is you actually leave out certain part of the goals and targets, which sometimes become very big because the indicators cannot be really very large in number. So, focus turns away from a lot of important areas of SDGs. So then what happens is what you measure that you actually achieve. So from that point of view, a lot of areas may get relegated to the background. So this is something which probably all of us need to look at. And then the other thing is that, there are many different different stakeholders who are actually involved. So how can we, get all these people together so that we can actually, address different parts of the targets and goals. So this is something probably needs a lot of attention at this point of time. So, so given my indices, my perspective, I am achieving SDG in a particular direction. Others may be doing in a different direction. So we need to look at how we can actually sync these aspects in a country, at a country level, at a regional level, so that we can actually make a coordinated progress towards SDGs. So these are some of the areas, and some of the allied areas. We actually, if we go deeper, certain other aspects of these will come on, which we need to address, so that we'll be able to more effectively address the SDGs. So are they relevant? Absolutely relevant, no question about it. How we are going to implement them, that depends. A lot depends on this, whether we'll be faced with shortcomings, problems. So we need to look at from practice point of view and make our practice much better. So that's what I think, and I'll stop here to allow other perspectives to come in. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sundar. That was a very detailed answer about SDGs and even monitoring and prioritizing focuses, which is something that was discussed beforehand by Mr. Khurshid as well. I am going to be displaying the answer that was provided by Professor Sanjeev, who unfortunately couldn't join us live. For those who have recently joined, he is the Pro-Vice Chancellor of the University of Mauritius, and Mauritius is also part of the Future Earth South Asia jurisdiction. So his answer to this question is echoing the answers by all the other panelists so far. There is no doubt that the SDGs are of direct relevance to countries in South Asia and their developmental needs. However, he says that there should be a proper action plan set up to keep track of the evolution of the 17 SDGs, or whichever is of relevance to a country's needs. These have to be prioritized in the first place. Moreover, we also need to provide action-oriented measures or policies to respond to the various indicators pertaining to each goal. One of the challenges remains the alignment of domestic policies, resource commitments, and proper planning to achieve the SDG targets, along with institutional changes, including new and amended laws. In addition, he says that there is a primordial to allocate tasks at various government levels and overcome layers of bureaucracy to better address the goals within a reasonable time frame. Yet one big hurdle, he says, is how to win the confidence of the private sector or the business community and the civil society to be better engaged in achieving the SDG targets. So Professor Sanjeev has also brought out a few concerns, and I think there's a point there that is almost the opposite of what Mr. Khurshid had mentioned earlier with regards to not focusing on particular goals, but to look at it as a whole, which is what is encouraged. But maybe we'll discuss that later, how to focus on a few goals or whether to look at it as a whole later on. Dr. Prajal, may we please have your response?
Thank you, Anupama. And thank you very much for this opportunity, and hello to all the participants and my fellow panelists. Yeah. So the question whether SDG is relevant for a particular country or not has been already answered. Now it has a global relevance, it has a regional relevance, and it has a local relevance. And while saying that, I would like to bring back to 2015, which we can call a historical year in terms of global sustainability. So there is it provides some hope for turning point. We don't know whether we managed to steer our planet to that direction or not, but at least there was a global, two big global agreement. One is a Paris Agreement in terms of limiting global warming well below 2-degree target. Second thing is on sustainable development goals, yeah, which consists of 17 SDGs, 169 target, and there is international or global indicator framework consisting around like 240 indicators. Sustainable development, the term itself is not so new. People has been talking about sustainable development since 1980s. And there is no standard, there is a definition like balancing economic, environmental, social aspect, talking about next generation and so on, but there was no clear targets, there was no clear, let's say, targets, indicators for sustainable development. But with SDGs, that's a breakthrough in my point of view in terms of this international negotiation, that the idea of sustainable development that was there for last 40 years has been conceptualized and providing a proper indicator. I would say like it's not perfect, but there is something graspable thing that happened with SDGs. Yeah? And I would say like in that context, it's not only relevant for Nepal or South Asia, it's relevant for whole globe. And the big thing or the novelty on sustainable development in compared to Millennium Development Goal is like before there used to be less developed country, highly developed country, or developing countries. With sustainable development, there is no called developed or developing countries. All the countries are developing countries when we look at sustainable development goals, because so-called high-income countries has their own problem and low-income countries has their own problem in terms of achieving sustainability. Yeah, so that's why it's relevant not only for South Asia but also for global north. But while saying that, it also has its own limitation. But I think this forum would not be the right thing to discuss more about this limitation. First, we have to think like how we can achieve those SDGs under the current constraint of pandemic. Yeah, and the second thing would be like in your question, it's also mentioned about planetary boundary and so on. That will be the next question that we need to tackle on like a post-2030 agenda. So that will be more like a preparation we need to do in next few years so that we can design the post-2030 agenda, learning the lessons from SDGs and then moving it more in the direction of like a more holistic approach. And here few things has been mentioned by fellow panelists here. Yeah, so holistic nature of the SDGs, definitely I agree with Khurshid that we definitely need to keep this holistic nature of SDGs. However, there is also the problem of that how to operationalize this holistic SDGs. And Anupama, you mentioned about this interconnectedness in terms of the interactions among the SDGs. I will bring back this issue during my talk later on, how we can prioritize certain SDGs, taking a holistic approach, not like a cherry picking based on what we want. Yeah. Second thing is like definitely we are in the constraint of pandemic and it has some impact on SDGs. And I would like to share share the experience from Nepal, like what is how Nepal thinks its SDG has been impacted by the pandemic later on as well. Yeah. So I will stop here with my comment at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Prajal. Yes, and thank you for talking about the planetary boundaries, and that's something that can be integrated at a later stage, learning from progress at the moment on the basic SDGs. That's an important point. Ms. Chamindry, would you like to share a perspective from Sri Lanka with us?
Thank you, Anupama. So good morning to everyone, fellow panelists and all the participants. I would just focus on the relevance of SDGs to a country like Sri Lanka. As you know, we are a country that had to deal with a prolonged conflict, so ethnic conflict. There were about 3 decades of violence that Sri Lanka had to finally the conflict, at least the armed struggle, was brought to an end in 2009. I think the philosophy and the principles underpinning the SDG agenda is very important and relevant for a country like Sri Lanka that is emerging from a prolonged conflict, and that would also help countries to address the particular challenges associated with the post-conflict transitions. I'm saying that because I think there's an emphasis on inclusivity and inclusive and participatory development in the SDGs framework, and also balanced and holistic development. This is very relevant to address some of the root causes of the conflict, particularly focusing on addressing specific vulnerabilities and geographical deprivations, etc., that I think were the root causes of the ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka. And of course, the multi-sectoral approach that is required for development planning. And having said that, as with regard to the weaknesses of the framework or the limitations, I would just try to bring in a more practitioner's perspective. What I found, being the Director General, the Chief Executive Officer of this institution that is responsible for SDG implementation in Sri Lanka, is that the complexity of the framework, and some of us have actually grappled with this for years in terms of the, in the localization process. And I think we are in the 7th year now, since 2015, into operationalizing is the type of overlaps in the framework between the different targets and the scope of the targets, which are not necessarily easily measurable. If you look at the indicators as well, they are not reflective of the scope of the targets, in most cases. And then the kind of data requirements in terms of monitoring progress. And I think we are still, coming to sort of trying to address some of these challenges, because our statistical system was not ready, in 2015. And I think after 7 years, we are still trying to build our statistical capacities. So that would actually help us in terms of more evidence-based planning to drive the agenda forward. So those are the limitations that I could see. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Saparamadu. And yeah, before I go on to ask the second question, actually, I would like to mention that we tried to put together a panel where our panelists come from different backgrounds, because we understand that something like the SDGs, it does involve lots of different stakeholders, like Mr. Sundar had mentioned. And we wanted that to be reflected in our panel today. And with regards to things like progress and limitations, it's always better to get perspectives from different places. So we have academia, we have the UN, we have practitioners. And I think that will sort of help steer discussions further, right? To figure out where further progress is needed. So with that, I will just quickly ask the second question, which is very much related to what I just mentioned right now, which is, what is the current status of institutionalized cross-sectoral collaboration and knowledge co-production towards development policies in the country or in the region at the moment, as per your experience and knowledge? And are there any efforts or suggestions towards improving these aspects of development planning? And the reason why this question is being answered is also because anyone who's been following these conversations in the recent past must have come across these words quite often. Now there's a lot of emphasis on multi-stakeholder collaboration and knowledge co-production between different stakeholders, getting different people together to address these issues. And we would like to know from our panelists what they think about all this. So we'll go back in the same order, beginning with Mr. Khurshid.
Thank you, Anupama. Let me just clarify one point before I get into the part of your question. I will focus on what are the efforts going on, particularly the UN side. When I mentioned that there is a risk of country becoming selective, it is not a opposite concept of prioritization. Of course, given the resource constraint, country will prioritize based on their local need. But what we need to be mindful about, what Prajal also mentioned, is the totality. So I think we should not lose focus of both the human welfare at the same time, the planetary welfare. I think these are the two interlinked aspects. And naturally, of course, countries will make progress or intensify their focus on inequality, poverty, inclusive growth, economic recovery. These are all natural and enable a factor also to achieve and accelerate SDG achievement. Okay, now let me tell you what I see going to happen and how UN is, particularly UNDP, is positioning in this effort of cross-sectional nature. What I personally see, and that's also an organizational view, that in a post-COVID context or midst of the COVID, there would be an increased attention on the resilience. Now we have a major challenge that our academia, bureaucracy, civil service, civil society, they're very good at managing growth. They're trained and they invested a lot how to make things happen, managing that. However, managing risk has always remained as a siloed concept and in the periphery. So what we're going to see that the piece of the resilience or management of the risk, be it pandemic or climatic or non-climatic, is coming towards the center. So that would be the core area of focus in next 10, 15 years coming. So achieving that, what UNDP is doing, I will give two examples since time is limited here. One is UNDP has set up, we call an accelerator lab to support the countries to accelerate implementation of SDGs. And those labs are set up in 110 countries now. I might be wrong with the figure, it's more than 100 plus countries, and all South Asian countries would have that lab. What they're doing, they're redefining the problem. The current challenges that we see problem through our sectoral specialization lens. But all the problems that, all the solutions share the common cause. That's how a new concept that we're applying is called systems thinking. So what is the implication of adoption of system thinking? We call it next generation governance. That would talk about risk as a system, problem as a system. Addressing that would require not cross-sectoral approach, but trans-sectoral approach. That means the way the bureaucracy is currently divided in entire South Asia, you would find a fragmentation. Ministry of Agriculture, or let's take an example of a municipality. You would have within a municipality a division working on solid waste management. And other part of the municipality would be looking at flood management. But the connectivity between proper solid waste management and flood management is often overlooked. So this is how circularity among the cause and effect and system that we call complex system that we need to train ourselves in development planning. So applying more systems thinking in the development planning, and UNDP is supporting many, many countries on that. Second point is also very important. If you look at our Human Development Report of 2020, that's on Anthropocene, new frontier or development at the age of Anthropocene. I think that's very important to look at what has been changed. Two things has been changed. Earlier Human Development Index, which determine a country's position, and my colleague from Bhutan has mentioned Bhutan's position at the very forefront because of its investment on environmental conservation, and Bhutan is a champion of the earth. Two things has been changed. One is two new indicators. One is the country's carbon dioxide emission and material footprint. So moment you have a planetary adjusted index, the human development has changed. Many of the countries used to be on the top, gone down now. I'm not naming it. So development is redefined, and we need to support that. That is what UNDP is doing, working with the government to make sure that the planetary adjusted, or the impact of our development on planetary system is also taken care of. And it is not just managing the risk, it is more about doing development differently. That's how I will stop for the time being. Over to you, Anupama.
Thank you, Mr. Khurshid. And thank you for bringing up the environment adjusted development in this instance, because that's something also that we've been discussing in our center. And it's good to know that that's also an integrated part of conversations at the UNDP, because that will go on and influence just global discussions. And we're excited to learn about countries that perform well in these kind of indicators, which also take into account planetary boundaries and planetary effects, to see how they're doing things differently and if we can scale those up in different cases. But moving on to Mr. Purna, another perspective from Bhutan.
Yeah, so I think again, I will talk in two aspects: local, firstly, as to giving a focus to Bhutan. Cross-sectoral collaboration in Bhutan is such that it's again governed by gross national happiness. So any kind of activity, any development policy, any development activity, projects, all need to go through a kind of screening process, which they call it as the GNH screening tool, So that will take care of all the sectors being brought together, and then the screening process is very objectively made, and it tries to screen projects and policies and through this sustainable development targets, So therefore, if a project need to be qualified to be started or not, need to go through this. So this is a local aspect, in our country, in Bhutan particularly. This is how the collaboration, cross-sectoral, things happen. So that's probably as Dr. Khurshid was trying to say, we are doing quite good, I should say. But in terms of collaboration in South Asia, in a global level, not local, but broadly, usually we tend to fail. Probably there is a political aspect in it, or some other aspects, which is not making the collaboration that conducive, So for example, we had one committee called SARC, South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, which at least I wanted to believe that it's not that functional these days, Probably these are all political or other reasons as to why these sectors are not working well. But of course, so that is regional kind of problem. But in a global problem like UN, UNDP, they are doing pretty good, especially in Bhutan's development. UNDP or World Bank, these are doing a lot of support and assistance in our country. So, of course, this cross-sectoral, especially in South Asia, is needed. I do not know where we can strike so that things get better. But yeah, I'd like to to end here.
Thank you, Mr. Purna. Yes, regional cooperation tends to be a bit of a challenge in almost any part of the world, really. And thank you for your answer. We would definitely like to learn more about, the way that the Bhutanese bureaucracy works with regards to cross-sectoral collaboration between departments. But moving on to Mr. Sundar from India, which, being such a large country and him having worked now with the state government and also earlier with the Niti Aayog, which was the nodal agencies for SDGs in India, maybe we'd like to learn more about how this sort of collaboration works at a much larger scale in between states as well as at the national level. If you could tell us a little bit about that.
Thanks, Anupama. And actually, a very important question. We do remain fragmented in within the sectoral boundaries, and that happens across institutions, across regions, and all that. But there is a conscious attempt to break out, and let me talk about certain. I mean, bring certain aspects of these efforts in the from the Indian side. Over the last 3-4 years, there has been a lot of breakthroughs which has happened in terms of intergovernmental collaboration. Intergovernmental, basically, I'm using it as a kind of functional term here. The working with between the central government and the state governments and the local governments, that has become much more functional. A lot of things are happening actually on that over the last 3-4 years. One area is basically, in terms of, agreeing on different indices for different goals and targets and measuring progress. So this is something which has actually very significantly progressed. From Niti Aayog side at the national level to different states and union territories, and also civil society, and in some from certain points of view, local governments also chipping in. So this is a lot of progress which has happened on this. So a lot of common understanding has been generated in terms of how to understand different goals and targets, and how to develop indices and how to generate data. So that is something, data is a single aspect which has seen a lot of progress over the last several 3-4 years. And that is not to say that we don't need progress. Actually we need a lot more. But if you look from 2017-18 and look at the current situation, there is a lot of progress which has happened. So at this point of time, there is a kind of if you would like to have a kind of snapshot of progress, local to country level, there are snapshots available. You might actually have pickup calls with certain parts of them, but there is something available, and this is progressively being built up. So that is one aspect. The other thing is in terms of bringing in corrective action. How we actually act on different targets and goals. On that also, a relooking of programs and schemes which are the major handles of the government all across the world to work on the SDGs. On that also, a lot of progress has happened in terms of understanding programs, understanding metrics and tools which can be used to monitor and make the programs effective, build up accountability of different structures which are part of this implementation system, and improving monitoring, so those aspects have also improved quite a lot. And knowledge co-production in terms of developing documents, developing tools and techniques, and shared understanding. There are a lot of things. A lot of progress has happened. And then across sector, like speaking from the, coming from the government to other sectoral, players. For instance, we talked about the private sector. Our friend from the Mauritius actually wanted to focus on that. So there are also a lot of good things which have happened in terms of connectivity between the private sector and the government, and also the connectivity between the private sector and the civil society and community-based organization and things like that. I would not say it's very advanced, but we have a lot of progressive signs which are there. And there is a very dynamic reporting framework now from the business side, which speak to the SDGs much more closely. So we know actually at least the big businesses and medium-sized businesses, how they are actually moving on the SDGs. And a lot of strategies have been developed by different organizations. We have some business sector organizations really doing well in terms of bringing themselves higher in terms of responsibility towards SDGs. So, and I mean, they have actually tried to move from a corporate social responsibility to a socially responsible business. So those tracks you can see in certain parts of the business sector, and it's increasingly being taken up by more people, and we need to go in that direction. The other part is in terms of knowledge production, bringing in academia and research institutions into the track, and because we have a lot of areas in which we need research-led interventions, in climate change, even in poverty alleviation, which can actually positively look at the trade-offs in terms of decoupling the environmental downsides and all that. So those areas also we need a lot of research-led intervention. I think we are quite, in fancy at that from that perspective. A lot needs to happen. We need to have a lot of engagement from the different research organizations, universities, and all that. So that conversation need to be much more thicker and much more dynamic. I think we are probably moving in that direction. The last part I'll talk about is basically how we bring in community organizations. I'll talk about much more in my next this thing. But just to mention how, because communities are all across, and they are very diverse, and how we relate to them, because ultimately a lot of things are going to happen there. So those areas, bit unsure at this point of time, what kind of dialogue can happen, what kind of collaboration can happen. Those areas need to look at need to be looked at in a very goal-focused way. So, and many more areas. So, but these are the good things, and there are certain areas we need to work more. So let's go ahead and see how we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sundar. So you've presented a very holistic overview of what progress looks like at the moment with regards to cross-sectoral collaboration and different parts of achieving the SDGs between different stakeholders. Now we'll go on to Dr. Prajal. I'll go over Professor Sanjeev's answer later, perhaps, but yes, due to shortage of time, let's just skip over to Dr. Prajal.
Yeah, thank you. This question of cross-sectoral approach is really crucial for SDGs. Yeah, but the problem still is that our governance mechanism is more like a silo approach, and then it takes time to change all those bureaucracy which has a long history, and maybe we need to give some time there. In context of Nepal, we have National Planning Commission, which is looking at sustainable development goals, and this is also the apex body of Nepal, which is related to make plans and policies regarding developments. Like it also the body which also look at how the budget is distributed across the sector. So there is some sort of like a governing body, which is a center body, which is supposed to look at SDGs. But in terms of implementation, it's still the silos approach. And here I would like to bring back a bit more this discussion we made in terms of interactions. So when we talk about SDGs, we talk about interconnectivity, we talk about interactions, but the question is like, are we measuring those interactions as well? Because if we don't measure those interactions, talking is one thing, but looking at those interactions is a bit different. And when you look at different reports, different monitoring framework from different government, there is no indicator, or there is no clear messages coming up, like whether they are able to break away the trade-offs among SDGs. Because what we see is that it was mentioned that in SDG 12 there is a indicator on material footprint, and what we know from our previous development phases, like whenever a country has an economic growth or poverty alleviation, it also increases the material footprint. Yeah. So are we if are we looking at those trade-offs we are generating whenever we are getting like an economic and social well-being, we are deteriorating our environment, and there are these trade-offs, and the question is like how to break these trade-offs, and we have to look this a bit more in a holistic way, and there should be also indicators or processes that should be implemented to measure these trade-offs. But so far that is not there. That's not there not only at the country scale for certain country, but when we look at this global reports, for example, annual report coming from Sustainable Development Solution Network. Yeah, if you look at those reports, they don't talk about trade-offs and synergies. They don't talk about how countries are dealing with this trade-off, or whether there is whether these trade-offs are increasing or decreasing across time. And when we talk about implementing SDGs, what we need to resolve this trade-off. Otherwise, this trade-off will be very hard in terms of achieving all the goals by 2030.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Prajal. That's a very interesting point. The question of trade-offs and synergies. That's not something that we've encountered as such very often yet, and that's an important point, especially for countries in this region that are still sort of are having to pick between different goals in terms of their development trajectory. So thank you for bringing that up. Ms. Chamindry, we would like to have your response to the second question now.
Thank you, Anupama. So I think a lot of the things that I also wanted to actually highlight came out, from the presentations of other panelists. But looking at Sri Lanka as well, we've encountered a lot of difficulties, challenges in terms of fostering cross-sectoral collaboration, simply also because of the fact that our government, particularly government institutional structure, is deeply fragmented. We've inherited that, and then there have been several initiatives to actually look at how do you promote and institutionalize vertical and horizontal integration that is required for SDG driven planning, implementation and monitoring. So one of the initiatives was to establish a prime ministerial committee, a steering committee for cross-sectoral collaboration and particularly for vertical integration that is required. This is yet to actually develop into a broader mechanism where we could also facilitate horizontal integration that is needed. And also another challenge has been the partnerships, with non-government stakeholders, because governments tend to work in silos. And there had been several initiatives. Of course, these are quite ad hoc in nature, where there is broader engagement, and collaboration across sectors and across various levels of government and across different stakeholder groups. In policy making, planning, and monitoring processes, sometimes, these initiatives are donor driven, but in terms of actually institutionalizing that, it has been a challenge, and, but steps have been taken, through the Prime Ministerial Committee to look at to how to institutionalize cross-sectoral collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Chamindry. That's a good little tidbit from Sri Lanka, and the Sustainable Development Council is also the main nodal agency to look at monitoring progress of SDGs implementation there as well. So it's good to have your perspective there with regards to this. I think that ends the two questions that we had for our panelists, but we will have to be skipping the interactive discussion between panelists for the moment. We do have a few questions from our audience right now, which I will quickly go over, and then our panelists can answer these. So the first questions I'll be picking up from the Q&A box that is live right now. In case any other audience members have any questions for our panelists, please feel free to add them there. We'll just go ahead with this for maybe another 10 minutes or so, and then we'll break for lunch. So very quickly, Okay, so the first question here is from Mohammad Rajakul Haider, and it doesn't say who it is addressed to. So please feel free to, any of the panelists, please feel free to raise your hand, and then you can take the question. So the question here is, how would we stay at financial sustainability due to most of the countries struggling with the COVID-19 pandemic? Would anyone like to take this question? It's quite a large question to be taken. If anybody has any inputs about this from their country's perspective, or else we'll skip right ahead and come back to this later. We have another question from Satya Jilena, who's joined us today. His question is, what are the top 3 key impediments and what are the key interventions needed to fast track the SDGs implementation in South Asia? So they're asking for any 3 major impediments and 3 key interventions. I think maybe I can direct that question to Ms. Chamindry ji. Would you like to take that up for Sri Lanka?
Sorry, Anupama, let me budge in here. There is also a reply by the panelists. I think Prajal would like to take this.
Oh, yes, it says.
Please
Yes, Dr. Prajal.
I will manage from here. Prajal, please go ahead.
Great, thank you. Thank you for this really interesting question, because definitely we have like 7-8 years to implement SDGs or to meet the goals, yeah. And we do have limited time, limited resources, and the question is like, what should be our priorities there? Yeah? But saying that, this is also a very tricky question to answer with a systematic study, yeah. So I can't give the particular answer for like what is the key factors. I will come back on the key factor from the COVID perspective later on in terms of Nepal. What are the key impacting factor that is hampering SDG improvement or SDG progress in Nepal in my talk later on. But here, what I would like to pinpoint is like, we need to do some sort of like a systematic analysis to understand this. Because there is this interrelation between SDGs or SDG targets, where a progress on one SDG may hinder the progress on others, or other way around, a progress on one SDG will also foster the progress in others. This is mainly based on the current development trend or business as usual scenario. And in that context, first we have to identify which are the key targets or the critical SDG targets which are creating those trade-offs. For example, SDG 12 is one of the biggest hurdle because whatever we are doing, economic growth is highly decoupled with environmental degradation. We have to break we have to break this linkages, or we have to decouple economic growth and environmental degradation. I would say like that would be one of the key target there. No? But talking about South Asia or a specific country, we have to go deeper on that country and look at this analysis. So last year, we published a paper based on the global analysis, and there we pinpoint like 1, 2, 3 different targets, which has like which has positive impact across whole SDG system. And we can say that, for example, when you look at this paper, I will share the link of the paper, which is also open access in the chat in a few minutes. The SDG 3 is one of the biggest factor or biggest, let's say, not the hurdle, but it's a biggest leverage that we can use. Like if we manage to achieve SDG 3, it has a lot of synergistic effect across all SDG system. This also holds for SDG 5, which is mainly women in the leadership position. So during the pandemic, we also saw the countries where there are women leaders, like mainly prime ministers, chancellors, yeah, they did quite well in terms of managing the pandemic. So this is also a sign that we need more leadership, women in the leadership position, in institutions, in universities, in private sector, and also in politics and governance. So we can clearly see that also from this study. And here in this study, we can also see that SDG 17, which is more about this North-South, South-South cooperation, mainly the extent of science and technology is quite crucial. Because whenever we are talking about this global negotiations, these countries are really conservative in terms of sharing knowledge and technology. They want to sell knowledge and technology but not share, and developing countries or low income countries cannot afford that. So SDG 17 could also be one of the leverages point there. But these are more from the global perspective. Based on this global data set, we can also look at this sort of thing based on SDG system model for individual country and pinpoint those key, or I will call them critical targets, which we need to prioritize to break away the trade-off and also to foster the synergies across the board. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Prajal. I'm so sorry I've not been able to take more questions. Very interesting questions coming, but I would like the attendees and the participants to stay back till the end of the session, which ends at 4 o'clock, and our panelists will be answering all your questions then. So we are calling for a break now because we have the best way to put it would be through this beautiful poster prepared by Anupama. So next event, we have special talks by all our delegates here on the status of sustainable development goals in their respective terrain and region. So we will break for 1 hour and we will join you at 1:15, that would be India time, 1:45 Bangladesh, Bhutan time. And please also see what time you need to join in for all our delegates.